Okay, so mind scientists of the embodied stripe have been making a powerful case for the cognitive centrality of organism-environment interactions. Not only do we rely on the external world for our metabolic needs, but we are coupled with the world through feedback loops of sensory motor actions and responses. That's one of the key ideas of the e-cognition Matt has talked about. So these loops, and that's the further step that I'm trying to make here, these loops shape our cognitive and conceptual apparatus at a very deep level. So as Daniel Hatto and other philosophers working in this field, in activism broadly conceived, put it, the mind is world involving. In this paper I would like to explore a specific aspect of this entanglement of mind and world. I will be looking at two experimental narratives that confront us with the world-involving nature of mind in unsettling ways, challenging presumptions about the separation between mind and world. So it's really a paper against dualism in a sense, and how narratives themselves can call attention to the problems inherent in this dualistic position. So these narratives, the one I will talk about, occur in different media, but deal with a similar set of thematic concerns. They are a short story by J.G. Ballard, The Terminal Beach, 1964, and The Arrester, an experimental video game developed by The Chinese Room, that's the name of the developer, and released in 2012. I'll have more to say about these case studies in a moment. For now, let me introduce the kind of world-mind entanglement that on my reading is at the root of both Ballard's short story and the video game, The Arrester. So here is a curious fact. The language we use to talk and perhaps think about, if we think in language, well, the language we use to talk about mental processes is highly metaphorical. John Barden has drawn up a comprehensive inventory of these metaphors, most of which can be subsumed under two conceptual models: the mind as a physical space where things happen, or ideas as physical objects that we can interact with. Expressions like inner life or the mental world, for instance, are based on this spatial metaphor. They are what David Herman has called a Cartesian geography of the mental. And of course, David Herman has critiqued this conception of mental processes in 2011. But, and this is my view, it is doubtful whether we'll ever get rid of these metaphors, because they are part and parcel of our folk psychology. So they are, part of what our everyday pre-scientific understanding of how the mind works. So it's not easy to do without metaphors. It's probably impossible. So for example, ideas enter our minds, a realization can dawn on us, and we should let bad news sink in. So all these are variations on the mind as physical space metaphor. The dawn metaphor, for example, describes a specific way in which a thought can emerge in consciousness, a gradual and of course a spatial process analogous to daybreak. Even scientific psychology has never been able to avoid metaphorical language. As David Leary has shown, from Aristotle's analogy between memory and a wax tablet to William James's stream of thought, the history of scientific psychology is essentially a long series of shifting and competing metaphorical models. So the paradoxical nature of these metaphorical mappings shouldn't escape us. Mind is what we are immersed in from birth to death. There is nothing that we should be more familiar with, and nothing that we should be more entitled to speak straightforwardly and literally about. And yet, even in exploring this most intimate domain, we speak in figures. And we do so by drawing on our embodied coupling with the physical world in the form of kinetic patterns, objects sinking in liquid, natural regularities, the sun rising above the horizon, or human-made artifacts inscribing a wax tablet. This paper examines how a single metaphorical mapping, mind as physical space, can be leveraged by experimental narrative in order to reveal the imbrication of physical and mental processes. My argument should be read as an attempt at cross-fertilizing embodied approaches to narrative with recent discussions on the enmeshment of human and material realities. So a point I will develop in the conclusion. Given the agenda of this paper, the inclusion of a short story by J.G. Ballard should come as no surprise. Influenced by Freud's topological model of the psyche, the British writer embraced spatial metaphors for mental processes throughout his work. In a famous essay titled Which Way to Inner Space from 1962, he critiqued the conventionality of science fiction and argued that the genre should turn to inner space. That is, the exploration of characters' psychology in relation to what he called the deep time of the human species, so the evolutionary history of our species. The terminal beach illustrates, so the story that I'm going to talk about, illustrates this interest in human evolution. Its protagonist, Traven, is an ex-military pilot stranded on Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, the site of a number of US nuclear tests in the 1950s. In his half-delirious ramblings, Traven envisages the dawn of a post-human species, arising from the ashes of a nuclear catastrophe. He calls it Homo hydrogenensis, Eniwetok man. This species would go beyond the limitations and, in Traven's term, the cosmic guilt of present-day human beings. Traven is also marked by psychological trauma. We learned that his wife and son died in a car accident, and he claims to be looking for them among the island's barren locations. The character thus fuses his private grief with concerns over the biological destiny of the human species. Dear Esther is an independent video game developed by British studio The Chinese Room. It was meant as an experiment on the artistic potential of the video game medium as part of an AHRC-funded project led by Dan Pinchback of the University of Portsmouth. The experiment was successful. When the game was released commercially in 2012, it drew considerable attention among critics and gamers alike. Dear Esther was praised for its vivid rendering of an island in the Hebrides archipelago off the Scottish coast, on which the narrator and protagonist is stranded, exactly like Traven in the Terminal Beach. But of course the similarities don't end here, as we'll see in a moment. This unnamed narrator is the character we are asked to control in the game. So Dear Esther belongs to an increasingly popular genre of exploration games where not much input is required from the player apart from steering the protagonist through a series of locations. There is little or no ludic challenge, and the emphasis is on what Harry Jenkins has called environmental storytelling, piecing together a narrative by uncovering clues scattered throughout the game world. So there is very little challenge. And actually one of the nicknames of this genre, especially among more hardcore players, is walking simulators. Because, you know, there's just a lot of walking to do, but not much more than that. In Dear Esther, most of the clues come from the narrator's own voiceover monologue, which gradually reveals his past life and present circumstances. The monologue is triggered by the players entering a new location, and is partly randomized. So after restarting the game, we may hear a different snippet of text when visiting exactly the same location, which of course is meant to encourage multiple playthroughs. So to get a better grasp on how all this works, let's have a look at the first few minutes of the game. This is the beginning. Lights are off.
Dear Esther, the morning after I was washed ashore, salt in my ears, sand in my mouth, and the waves always at my ankles, I felt as though everything had conspired to this one last shipwreck. I remembered nothing but water, stones in my belly and my shoes, threatening to drag me under to where only the most listless of creatures swim. Donnelly reported the legend of the hermit, a holy man who sought solitude in its most pure form. Allegedly, he rode here from the mainland in a boat without a bottom, so all the creatures of the sea could rise at night to converse with him. How disappointed he must have been with their chatter. Perhaps now, when all that haunts the ocean is the rubbish dumped from the tankers, he'd find more peace. They say he threw his arms wide in a valley on the south side and a cliff opened up to provide him shelter. They say he died of fever 116 years later. The shepherds left gifts for him at the mouth of the cave, but Donnelly records they never claimed to have seen him. I have visited the cave and I have left my gifts, but like them, I appear to be an unworthy subject of his solitude.
Okay. So the whole game is about exploring the space of the island and listening to these very poetic sort of monologues and trying to figure out what's going on and what happened to the narrator. So as you can see, or as you could hear, the narrator's musings are mostly cast in epistolary form, as if they were letters addressed to Esther, the narrator's wife, hence of course the title. We find out towards the end of the game that Esther died in a car accident. Just like Draven in the Terminal Beach, the narrator is overcome with grief, and we may ascribe the monologue's occasional lapses and inconsistencies to the character's mental imbalance. Indeed, both the Terminal Beach and the Arrest are examples of what Lars Bernhardt calls narrative delirium, namely texts where the narrative progression, the plot, is fueled by the protagonist's incoherent or delirious perception of the fictional world. In the following analysis, I will tackle Ballard's short story and Dear Esther in order to show how in both texts the narrative delirium converges with the physical space of the setting. Ballard's short story is subdivided into 22 sections of an equal length, most of them titled after one of the island's locations. What Ballard calls the synthetic landscape of Eniwetok is described in minute detail, evoking a strong sense of place. For the willing reader, it is easy to project herself into the deserted and dust-strewn island, which is dominated by camera towers, concrete blocks, bunkers, and colorless beaches. Yet, despite the materiality of this space, Ballard chooses to focus on its psychological dimension. Early on in the story, we read, this island is a state of mind. The protagonist himself reflects that, quote number 2 on the slide, if primitive man felt the need to assimilate events in the external world to his own psyche, 20th century man had reversed this process. By this Cartesian yardstick, the island at least existed in a sense true of few other places. With its abandoned ruins, the island's landscape has thus become an externalization of deep-seated fears of nuclear disaster and annihilation. The text repeatedly suggests that these fears reflect species-wide psychological patterns and put us in touch with our remote ancestors. Thus we are told that the island's, number 3, functional megalithic architecture is as grey and minatory as any of Assyria and Babylon. A passage in which the reference to ancient civilizations reinforces the sense that the island is connected with a deep time of the human species. The paradox is that by prefiguring a nuclear apocalypse, the island appears to point to the future as much as to a distant past. The narrator observes, number 4, the series of weapons tests had fused the sand in layers, and the pseudo-geological strata condensed the brief epochs, microseconds in duration, of thermonuclear time. Typically, the island inverted the geologist's maxim, the key to the past lies in the present. Here, the key to the present lay in the future. This island was a fossil of time future. The final oxymoron, fossil of time future, conveys the difficulty of grasping the nature of this place, whose temporality is schizophrenically divided between distant past and post-apocalyptic future. Predictably, the situation is not without consequences for Draven's psyche. The whole story can be read as a thought experiment documenting the mental decline of a character exposed to an impossible environment. After the narrator's initial stage-setting descriptions, the text shifts to an internally focalized account of the island's impact on Traven. First, his sense of time collapses. Number 5, life became completely existential, an absolute break separating one moment from the next, like two quantal events. End quote. Traven's exposure to deep time causes a breakdown in his understanding of small-scale temporality, his sense of time. Unable to link together the events he experiences, he is left with a series of quantal, that is, discrete and microscopic units. Space itself seems to be organized in a similar way. The island's identical blockhouses are painstakingly described. Note how the narrator is quick to catch on the psychological effects of this spatial arrangement. Quote number 6. There were 2,000 of them, so the blockhouses, each a perfect cube 15 feet in height, regularly spaced at 10-yard intervals. With their geometric regularity and finish, the blocks imposed on Traven a mood of absolute calm and order. End quote. The narrator even ventures a neurophysiological explanation of the changes in the character's psyche. Quote number 7. Since the discovery of the blocks, he had become a creature of reflexes, kindled from levels above those of his existing nervous system. If the autonomic system was dominated by the past, Traven sensed, the cerebrospinal system reached towards the future. By directly acting on Traven's cerebrospinal system, the island dulls his grief, making him temporarily forget his quest for his wife and son. This response is compared to a reflex, a low-level reaction hardwired into Traven's unconscious, which the island seems uniquely able to trigger. Not just the character's sense of time, but also his mood and bodily feelings are altered by this place. From this existential viewpoint, Traven can envisage a post-human being, Homo hydrogenensis, he calls it, a species shaped by nuclear disaster. Shortly after this realization, Traven has a final hallucinatory vision of the island. This is quote number 8. Around him, the lines of cubes form the horizon of his world. At times they would appear to advance towards him, looming over him like cliffs, the intervals between them narrowing so that they were little more than an arm's length apart, a labyrinth of corridors running between them. They would recede from him, separating from each other like points in an expanding universe, until the nearest line formed an intermittent palisade along the horizon. Mirroring the fluctuations in Traven's perception, this description works towards connecting the landscape of the island with a larger spatial scale, signaled here by the double reference to the horizon and by the simile comparing the corridors to points in an expanding universe. After this description, Traven attempts to take leave of the island in a crescendo that goes from his saying goodbye in Iwetok to a final goodbye in Moscow, London, Paris, New York. He stops only when he realizes, quote number 9, the futility of this megaphone farewell. Such a leave-taking required him to fix his signature upon every one of the particles in the universe. End quote. The island thus becomes, at least on my reading, a window onto cosmic realities. If the short stories succeed in grafting Cold War era anxieties onto the texture of Traven's experiences, it is only through the unsettling spatiality of the island. Ballard attributes psychological significance to the story's setting, but this move is more radical than the simple thematization of space. The island does not symbolically mirror Traven's psyche. Rather, the narrator's interventions make clear that the barren landscape of Eniwetok effectively reshuffles Traven's personality by tapping into his hardwired receptivity to calamity and extinction. The figurative notion of an inner space is therefore elevated to a neurophysiological reality, the effect of the spatial features of the island on equally physical, material processes in Traven's body. Participating in Traven's experiences, readers are thus likely to realize that, in the language of Clark and Chalmers's extended mind hypothesis, the character and the island are a quintessentially coupled system. In this way, the terminal beach shows how human minds and the material world are joined in a psychophysical grip, whose reach is not just personal and historical, but fundamentally cosmic. We now move on to the second case study. Unlike the terminal beach Dear Esther contains no third-person internally focalized text, but rather, as we've heard, a first-person narration, a first-person narrative based on snippets of monologue triggered by specific locations. Consider, for example, the sequence from the last part of the game.
We will mix the paint with ashes and tarmac and the glow from our infections. We will paint a moon over the Sanford Junction and blue lights falling like stars along the hard shoulder.
Walking along a cliff, we run into photographs of a car crash, probably the crash in which Esther lost her life. This triggers a monologue where a few suggestive details begin to emerge. The tarmac, the mention of the Sanford Junction, and the hard shoulder are clear references to the scene of the accident. A second candlelit altar displays a defibrillator and a small collection of surgical instruments, all objects that serve as painful reminders of Esther's death. These are affect-laden encounters that are meant to convey the narrator's grief and evoke a melancholy mood in the audience. Interestingly, these objects scattered throughout the game world seem to complement rather than overlap with the narrator's monologue. While poetic in tone, the narrator's words are largely devoid of direct emotional expressions. His love for Esther remains unstated, and we find few, if any, attempts at capturing how the narrator actually feels. The narrator's affectivity seems to be devolved to the island in the form of the candlelit altars or other material stand-ins for his traumatic experience of loss. The protagonist's grief is thus externalized onto the island as players are asked to connect the dots between the verbal narrative and the physical environment they explore. This is an extreme case of distributed cognition, one in which experiences that are traditionally seen as inner and private are offloaded onto the world through what Edwin Hutchins would call material anchors, that is, physical objects standing in for relatively abstract meanings, in this case, the narrator's emotions. Should we conclude that space in Dear Esther is purely symbolic, a projection of the protagonist's state of mind? We've seen that this was not the case for Ballard's Island, because the narrator repeatedly emphasizes how the space of the island undermines Traven's mental processes through real, neurophysiologically grounded effects. Something similar happens in Dear Esther, particularly because of the associations generated by the narrator's monologue. We've seen that the script never lingers on the protagonist's emotional experience. What the script does, however, is consistently map his body and bodily functions onto the space of the island, leading to a number of surprising, if slightly puzzling, metaphorical associations. This effect is visible already in the opening line. Quote number 1, "Dear Esther, I sometimes feel as if I've given birth to this island." Here. Note how the symbolic reading of the island is discouraged by the narrator's claim to have given birth to this place, a metaphor that puts his attitude towards the space firmly in the realm of bodily, not mentalistic experience. The narrator constantly refers to the caves as the island's guts, belly, and veins. At times the focus shifts, and it is not the island to have guts, but the narrator to have his own guts in the caves. Quote number 2, "If the caves are my guts, this must be the place where the stones are first formed. The bacteria phosphoresce and rise, singing through the tunnels." In another passage, it is Esther's body, not the narrator's, to become one with the space of the island. "You were all the world like a beach to me, laid out for investigation, your geography telling one story, but hinting at the geology hidden behind the cuts and bruises." This allusion to cuts and bruises is probably another echo of Esther's death. In Dear Esther, the narrator's embodied attitude towards the island is always mediated by a keen awareness of the body's mortality, his own and Esther's. Ultimately, Dear Esther is marked by a sense of fluid embodiment, where the boundaries between inner experience and world, and between human and non-human spaces, are constantly blurred and renegotiated. Readers' familiarity with body parts and diseases is leveraged towards their understanding of the island's physical environment, and vice versa. The island's geography serves to render the narrator's bodily experience and objectify, through the affect-laden props, his grieving process. As in The Terminal Beach, this sense of human-non-human enmeshment takes on a cosmic dimension. Take, for example, the following line, quote number 4, "Where you saw galaxies, I only saw bruises, cut into the cliff by my lack of sobriety." Bodily injury, probably resulting from Esther's car accident, is here compared to the island's landscape, the cliffs, which are in turn mapped onto a vision of galaxies. Only by embracing this cosmic perspective is it possible to fully grasp the implications of Esther's death, and perhaps take the edge off of the narrator's grief. The video game's final sequence, apologies for the spoiler, strongly hints at this idea.
We will leave twin vapor trails in the air, white lines etched into these rocks. Dear Esther, I have burnt my belongings, my books, this death certificate. Mine will be written all across this island. Who was Jacobson? Who remembers him? Donnelly has written of him, but who was Donnelly? Who remembers him? I have painted, carved, hewn, scored into this space all that I can draw from him. There will be another to these shores to remember me. I will rise from the ocean like an island without bottom, come together like a stone, become an aerial, a beacon, that they will not forget you. The gulls will return and nest in our bones and our history. I will look to my left and see Esther Donnelly flying beside me. I will look to my right and see Paul Jacobson flying beside me. They will leave white lines carved into the air to reach the mainland, where help will be sent.
So we see the protagonist climbing a radio tower, which you can actually see from anywhere in the island. It's the final location of the game. So we see him climbing the radio tower and throwing himself into the void in what is apparently a suicide attempt. However, and I don't know if you could see it here because it was too dark, but one instant before hitting the ground, the protagonist turns into a bird, as indicated by a shadow projected onto the ground, and surprisingly flies away. This leads to a final tracking shot, a flyover of the island, in which the avatar, the character, comes to rest over the sea amid paper boats folded, so we are told in a previous moment, out of the letters he had sent Esther. So while in the terminal beach, the post-human consists in the evolution of the human species after a nuclear catastrophe, here it takes on a more intimate, almost metaphysical dimension. It is a shadowy hope of permanence after death, not in the sense of a dualistic survival of the soul, but in a final embrace with the non-human realities of the island, such as the gulls, the cliffs, and the sea. Conclusion. The route to the mental taken by Dear Esther is more poetic and suggestive than Ballard's approach in The Terminal Beach, but they have two key elements in common. First, in both narratives, spatial metaphors for mental processes are literalized into loops of mind-world interaction. The world becomes key to understanding the protagonist's minds. In this way, as I have tried to show in this paper, The Terminal Beach and Dear Esther go against the grain of mind-body dualism. Metaphorical language for mental processes is, after all, susceptible to a dualistic reading. Mind as physical space is a metaphor insofar as, on a certain understanding of the comparison, the mind is not spatial at all, but it actually exists at another non-physical level. By focusing on the coupling of mind and the space of the island, and by suggesting in different ways that this space is real and not merely symbolic, The Terminal Beach and Dear Esther avoid the dangers of dualism. They imply a form of psychophysical reductionism, a sense that the mind arises from patterns of bodily interaction with the material environment. Second, these narratives demonstrate that confronting the material basis of mind inevitably raises questions about the relationship between human subjectivity, and perhaps subjectivity in general, and non-human realities. How does mind emerge from mere matter? How are we tied invisibly yet powerfully to non-human animals, human-scale objects, and even realities such as the bits in what Matt showed, even realities that escape our perceptual and cognitive apparatus? By itself, narrative cannot provide answers to these thorny problems, but it has the imaginative and emotional power to show the relevance and perhaps their inescapability. Ecological philosophers such as Timothy Morton, Jane Bennett, and others have called attention to the entanglement of human life and non-human things in an attempt to undermine a culturally entrenched but deeply problematic conception of the human as metaphysically sealed off from material realities. This paper sought to show how the position of embodied cognitive science, and particularly its critique of mind-body dualism, converge with this philosophical program at a very fundamental level. It seems to me that this convergence opens up rich possibilities for cross-fertilization between embodied approaches to narrative and environmental philosophy. Metaphor should play a key role in this effort, for it provides the key link between mental and non-human phenomena in narrative representations. At the same time, we should remain aware of the limitations inherent in any particular metaphor. My case studies highlight these limitations by appealing to bodily experience and discarding a purely symbolic reading of space. They challenge dualistic ways of thinking and can potentially put us in touch with realities beyond the human. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks. So we can open up to questions either just for Marco or for Matt and Marco, or any combination there.
Do we both come here, or should we stay just?
Yeah, sure.
Bring a chair, yeah?
Yeah.
Good idea.
Just trying to tie together, this is mainly for Marco, trying to tie together a bit of what Matt told us about e-narratives together with Dear Esther, particularly the kind of experiential aspects of playing through this kind of narrative. Hyperlinks, like Matt said, are imbued with possibilities, and those are present in a number of kind of texts. It seems there are no obviously proper hyperlinks in Dear Esther. There doesn't seem to be a lot of clickings. It's just a kind of a walking simulator. Are there possibilities for mis or alternate readings? Some kind of corollary of clicking or not clicking a hyperlink in the game, or is it pretty much just a stable narrative throughout that we simply play through?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, of course, part of the script is randomized, so we have to actually play it several times in order to, complete our imagination of the story world. But I think the story that emerges is more or less stable. So there is no, of course, game narratives can play with interactivity, different endings. In this case, we don't have any of that. I mean, the most basic elements of the story are sort of fixed, and we just have to reconstruct them. But games can approach narrative in many different ways, and actually, it's pretty interesting to see how interactivity interacts with or sort of overlaps with narration and what kind of experiments can be created. But this is not something that applies, I think, well to Dear Esther.
Somebody else had a question. I'll follow before. You said at the beginning when you were talking about inner life and the spatial metaphor of the mind, and I think, and please tell me if I'm wrong, you sort of said, I don't think we're going to change that, the metaphor of the mind as spatial.
Yeah.
But then I feel like one of the things it seemed like you went on to demonstrate, and which to some degree I think was demonstrated in Matt's talk, is the way in which new art forms, new ways of telling stories are prompting us to come up with new metaphors. Because in the experience of Dear Esther, that juxtaposition where the defibrillator becomes a material anchor for an emotion that's not present anywhere else, thus must be kind of staged in the embodied reader. It seems to me begins to offer the opportunity for another metaphor wherein mind is distributed amongst artifact, narrative, myself as the reader, textual information that is not pointing at emotion at all, but comes together at the intersection of all these three. So I'm just curious to what degree we might think about these new modes of reading as attempting to get us to think of a new mode of thinking about the mind where its operation is located. And where is the wrong word already.
Yeah. No, I mean, what I was saying at the beginning is that the ways in which we talk about the mind are metaphorical, but of course this doesn't mean that we are stuck with always the same metaphors. So we can change metaphors as we proceed.
So you're not saying that...
No.
Okay. So
we can get rid of the metaphors, but of course we can change them. And actually what I think is interesting in many areas is trying to triangulate different metaphors and see what kind of insights they offer.
Great, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
I'm glad I was wrong.
So this is, I guess, for both of you, and similarly talking about new modes of storytelling or experiencing knowledge that, and Matt, you appropriately, I think, focus on the object the whole time. So maybe to venture out towards the reader or the experiencer, hyperlinks, it's not new anymore, but interactive storytelling games are new. How much of this, like these affordances that are available, maybe for rethinking the mind or whatever, has to do with the familiarity of the person with hyperlinks, first of all, or the medium? Like you said, hardcore gamers would have a difficult time experiencing this and having this same kind of, what you're talking about. So, what aspect of familiarity or expertise or something has to do with these new media?
So the main body of my work, I guess, is about expertise and what it means to be an expert and what it means to become proficient with things. So I think it's super important. With these kind of new media forms, I think you have to be aware of how they're functioning in order to really get what they're doing. I guess that's part of what I wanted to talk about, was the way that authors can only start to play with this stuff once the readership or once the players have reached a certain level of sophistication. I can remember the first time that dual analog sticks came in on gaming devices, and like that still blows my mother's mind. She cannot operate two sticks with her thumbs at the same time at all, and so she literally cannot take that pose in a game world. She can't move through that space, and so can't get like how something like Dear Esther is literally just playing with your head and like your movement in space, like that's unavailable to her. And if most gamers were like that, then Dear Esther can't really function. It becomes avant-garde. Like, it's only now that Dear Esther, where there's a gamership which is able to understand moving through a space like that, what it means to stop and look, how games normally don't encourage you to stop and look. I think that's like part of like Dear Esther's power, is you need a very sophisticated gaming audience in order to pull that off. And I think, like, again, hyperlinks are only meaningful if you follow thousands and thousands and thousands of them and been surprised by them, or not surprised, or think, oh, I don't have to follow that link, I do have to follow this, and things like that. I think like that familiarity, that's what opens them up to be, not to have meaning, but to be meaningful. I think that's where the distinction, expertise leads to meaningfulness for me.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a matter of expertise in relation to the medium, but also the genre that we're playing. You know, in this case, Dear Esther is a very good example of this, because many hardcore players would just consider it not very interesting as a game, just because it's not challenging enough for them. So that's you know, it's also stratified expertise, I'd say.
I think Minecraft is another really interesting example of this. Like, the popularity of Minecraft is baffling to a whole like subsection of gamers.
Sure.
We're going to have a whole generation coming through who are used to gaming. Like, what if I can't build? Well, you know, if I can't like take that ownership, then it doesn't feel like gaming to them. And that kind of sandbox mentality, I think, is really important. Like GTA like reinforces that as well, like being able to make your own space in your own games. And Dear Esther plays against that backdrop as well, going, no, at this time, like, stories and making you walk through these spaces to get the story, like that takes on its own layer of meaningfulness against that backdrop of total freedom as well. It's not a very free game at all.
Thank you so much. This question is from Marco. So I already sort of feel that I'm on board with the Clark and Chalmers extended mind hypothesis. And something that your talk did that was very unexpected for me, it almost gave me a kind of reductio ad absurdum of that view. And let me just explain why. So in their view, you'll know that what it is for like memory to be extended is that there has to be some part of your memory that is no longer functioning, such that you need some kind of PDA or date book or whatever. When they wrote it, it was like date books or whatever. And so it's like the sort of immediately accessible and the reliability and the sort of connection that couples you with this thing in the external world. And if it was vision, and you can imagine it's a guide dog because you're blind, and then you have this like coupling with the guide dog. But in the talk you gave, in both cases, it seems like instead of just lacking memory and therefore using something in the external world as a kind of coupling device, it's the entire mind that is being sort of that is being coupled with, to the point where like the narrators, they lose their minds in the end. And that just makes me wonder whether the extended mind hypothesis that they give out sort of only works in a modular way, but not whole hog. That you can't actually sort of couple the entire mind with the environment, because then there's like somehow there's no mind left. Something like that, which reinforces a kind of dualism almost. And so this is why I find your talk so fascinating, because it's almost like carrying out this idea to its extreme and then finding it actually turns back on itself. So can you say more
very interesting.
about sort of the end of these stories where the narrators seem to lose it? But that's also when they've completely sort of coupled themselves with the island, and it's come to stand in for the mind, but then there's none of these entities left. So can you say more about what happens to the characters, or what you think about this unfortunate place I've been led to?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to tell, because that's the thing with artifacts of this kind, that they open themselves up to interpretation, but ultimately it's very difficult to tell what argument they are making, if any argument, you know what I mean? But I really like the idea of the reductio ad absurdum. I think it's, I hadn't thought about that, but it's definitely something that, they could be doing here. And about the modularity, in fact, what is offloaded here is not the things, the kind of mental function that Clark and Chalmers tend to talk about, so memory, for example, but things like emotion, it's very difficult to see how they could be extended in the world, because we tend to consider them as innerly sort of private, subjective sensations that are very difficult to see as externalized. I'll think more about it.
And I'm okay. If there was someone who said, yes, we can do this sort of same thing for an emotion that we did. You used to think that memory was something you had to experience, but now if you buy into the Clark and Chalmers story, you say, it's just kind of having reliable access to facts that you've once encountered. And, okay, I buy that functionalist account, and maybe you could convince me of memory too, and maybe you can convince me of all the different sort of processes, mental life. But the whole mind itself, once you offload that onto the island.
Yeah, this link between the externalization and madness, I think, is quite interesting.
To kind of tie some of that stuff together. When you first said PDA, I didn't realise that you meant an assistant. I thought you meant public display of affection. And it just immediately shot me to a study that was done of old couples who use one another as prosthetic memories, and people not being able to remember stuff and being able to do that offloading. And while I was researching about that kind of stuff, I was reading Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, and there's a moment in that where she talks about a woman who was the victim of the MK Ultra program, pumped full of LSD and tortured essentially by the American government, and completely lost the ability to form short-term memories similar to the main character in Memento. And she has cigarette boxes all around her house with scrawlings of the day, and she has completely exported her mind into her surroundings in that way, and it's so linked with madness in her head and that frustration, and that idea of there is a humanness which breaks down the more that you have to offload with the PDA, with the giving of yourself to someone else. There's a certain kind of emotional breakdown there that's kind of interesting. And then there's this going too far, and eventually you become a seagull. There is a limit there that I think is kind of fascinating. Just one last thing that kind of had that offloading. I've been trying to find limits to the extended mind thing as well, and I'm really interested about fetish objects and whether that externalization of sexuality. I think that could be a really fruitful area of study that no one's written on. I really want someone to. I don't know if I've got the expertise to fill that gap, but that exporting of sensation almost onto something in your environment that happens a lot with disability and prosthetics as well, and the sexualization of prosthetics. And I think that could be a really fruitful area for the exporting of things that we tend to think as very internalized or very bodily at the very least, also being able to be extended. That all came from PDA. It was interesting.
Can I just make one thought? And I may very well be wrong, but it strikes me that the loss of the mind is when there's a complete, it's a decoupling, because you've situated your mind in the island and you're no longer necessary. And so in the same way that a metaphor only works when they aren't the same thing, there are selected projection between spaces. So, if once your whole mind is the island, then there is no need for you, and you might as well become a seagull.
So if you're interested in this stuff, you should look up about ayahuasca and DMT experiences and that kind of ego death. And lots of people report this during really intense tripping, is that complete abnegation of the self as you melt into your surroundings. And that there's something about that kind of decoupling and offloading that kind of goes together. There's just a lot being written on ayahuasca at the moment. I have no idea why it's become a resurgence in the transhumanism community.
Is talking about it.
It does crop up.
So this is initially for Matt, but maybe Marco also with the DRS stuff. So in terms of like the future of the book, which is kind of an interesting thing, and mostly, this is big for you, and this mostly bullshit idea that like the print book is dying or whatever. How do you think your work, this is predominantly I guess about the theater book, but also the research or theoretical component of reading, where does that fit in? I mean, like you said that the theater book is somewhere between the print book and the digital book. It's kind of a little space, which seems to have a really high use value for just research in general. But it's also going to cost $1,000, which is a bit of a bummer. Do you think that this sort of liminal space that this project occupies, or something a little maybe more towards the print book, like Tree of Codes or House of Leaves, or these sorts of increasingly multimodal print books, is that where you think this is heading?
I think in no way is this stuff going to be mainstream like at all. Like I think like it's going to be an avant-garde, but I think you're going to have a group of people that are really, really committed to it in the same way as vinyl. So about that kind of space, and that's not small by any stretch, but it's, you know, tens of thousands a year, not millions a year. Like Daniel, I don't know if you've read Daniel Epstein's new book.
I have volume 1.
Yeah. And it's cool. Like Mark Danielewski's new book is 27 volumes long, and it's about cats, and that's all we know really at the moment. And it's this multimodal text that's going to have digital elements, and there's meant to be stuff like located in space. I think we'll see those kind of experiments coming through. But I think just most reading will probably gradually shift to being digital. Is my hunch. All my students now, like, most of them do all of their reading from PDF. I don't think we're going to see like radical new forms emerging that straddle print and digital as a default. It still amazes me that Amazon haven't coupled together ebooks and print books. Like when you buy like a printed book or you don't get the ebook for free, that seems crazy to me. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's my hunch. But there will be games like DRS and stuff which straddle that digital thing coming in through increasingly.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
No, thank you.